So tonight we're in a rather popular and controversial chapter in the Bible. It's Genesis 6. It begins the global flood account that continues on into chapter 8. It's talked about a little bit in 9 and 10, but for the most part there in chapter 8, the flood is done. Noah's on land and things start post-flood. But to get this started tonight, we want to get off on the right foot. So for the first part of the chapter, I want us to study it in conjunction with a New Testament passage that takes this Genesis 6 account of the flood and makes a New Testament tie-in to our present day. There's a couple of them, and we're going to take and look at Luke 17. The related topics that we're going to find here in the Genesis 6 account are going to reveal things to us about our present, current living situation, the society that we live in, the things that we see go on around us. And it should help us to see exactly where we sit in the prophetic timeline. We may not be able to get all of this covered tonight, but we'll get well underway with it. Here's what we know. The Lord says we can't know the hour, the day or the hour of His coming, but the Lord does expect His people to be prophetically aware of the signs and the seasons of the general time periods that we're in. It was one of the things Jesus had to say about Jerusalem on the day of His triumphal entry as He overlooked the city. And His statement to the city was how much He loved the Jews, how much He loved the Jewish nation, and how often He wanted to just gather up the Jews and bring them under, bring them to Himself as a hen gathers the chicks. But He couldn't do that because they chose a different way. And one of the remarks that Jesus made there concerning the Jews was that they had missed the day of His visitation to the nation. They weren't ready for it. It was their time. Jesus said, "You've missed it. This your time. You've missed it because you weren't prophetically aware of the season that you were living in. You should have known, but they didn't know." And we don't want to be guilty of that same thing. We don't want to be guilty of failing to see the seriousness of the climate, the global climate. No, I'm not talking about the weather. Talking about the global spiritual climate that we live in today. So let's begin with this. Take your finger and mark it there in Genesis 6. We're coming right back to it. But flip to Luke chapter 17. I'm going to read verses 26, verse 27, and verse 30. It says this, "And as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage. Everything was chugging along just normally and just fine until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Even so it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." Now for homework, we don't have time to read all these, but for homework, go home and read 2 Peter chapter 3. Read that whole chapter because Jesus taught Luke 17 to Peter and the disciples, and from that, Peter would take and make these statements in 2 Peter 3 about the connection between the days of Noah and our day. And so Peter expounds on that a little bit. I'll leave that to you to study on your own, but you'll see a great connection there. You'll see some great words in there. You'll see that the outlook of the world for us today is the same as it was for Noah. He was out there hammering and chiseling away on an ark year after year after year and preaching that the sky was falling. Oh no, another one of those skies falling preachers. Gloom and doom. But he was out there saying, whatever his message was, it's going to rain. And they thought, well, we don't even know what rain is. It's never rained on the earth before. This guy's talking about water falling from the sky, maybe water breaking up from the deep underneath the crust of the earth. He's out here preaching this message of destruction. And it's all based on things we've never seen before, this specific type of destruction, and they thought he was a lunatic. You would too. I probably would have too if I wasn't in tune with the prophetic times that I lived in. It was really out there. But he faithfully did. You and I are kind of in the same boat. There's a difference between our end. We're not marching toward another global flood. That's been done once and promised never to be done again. But we're marching toward the destruction of the earth by fire. By fire. The scriptures tell us that the day is coming when the elements of the earth will melt with fervent heat. This all is just going to completely dissolve one day in fire. We have a long time to go before we get there, so I want to just clear this up before we get too far, that when we preach about end times, we preach a little bit differently than Noah preached. Noah was marching toward a 40-day global flood when water for 40 days would deluge the earth and kill everything in it that wasn't in the ark. We are not preaching that there's coming this sudden cataclysmic 40-day event that's going to completely wipe out the earth. That's not what we preach. What we are marching to in our prophetic times and seasons, we are marching toward first the rapture of the church, where the Lord comes back and takes away the saints. He takes the church up to be with Him. You're all very familiar with that. And what follows is what's spoken about in Revelation chapter 6 through 18, the tribulation period, a.k.a. the time of Jacob's trouble, or the time of Israel's trouble, a.k.a. the day of wrath, a.k.a. the day of the Lord, all of these terms synonymous. And as we march toward that, the end that we're coming to is a little bit different, because once the church is removed, then all that's left on the earth are those that have rejected Christ. And what He's going to do is He's going to begin to pour out His wrath on the earth as judgment against those that have rejected the salvation that Jesus has offered. And it is going to be a progressive and intensifying as time goes, 7-year period of divine catastrophes that are sent to the earth. As time goes on the earth becomes more and more inhabitable. But even after that 7-year period, has the world ended? No. No, we're coming to the end of an age, but we're not coming to the end of the world. The age that we are coming to the end of is the age of grace, the dispensation of grace. Again, a.k.a. the time of the Gentiles. This is our day. This is the day when salvation can be so easily received from the Lord, but that day, that era, that dispensation, that time period is coming to a close. And when that comes to a close, the world's still here. 7 years of tribulation where God is trying to weaken the stubbornness of the people that have rejected Him. 7 years as He extends His grace to bring people to Him. He'll make it as clear as He can. And don't think that those going through the tribulation period will not understand what's happening. They say it right there in the Scriptures. Hide us, save us, hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. They know where the judgments are coming from, but does that change them? Most of them it does not. They keep on in their rejection of Christ. At the end of that 7-year tribulation period, there's a battle. And those that have rejected Christ are overcome. Those that are left are those that are in line with the Lord's reign. And for 1,000 years, after the 7 years of tribulation, the earth is still going. The Lord reworks it and restores it. It still goes 1,000 years. And then it's at the end of that 1,000-year period that the Lord will have that final battle against His enemy, Satan. After 1,000 years of being chained up in the pits of hell, the bottomless pit, He'll be let loose. There will be an uprising. There will be an attempted coup. And the Lord wins the battle by the power of his words, by the two-edged sword that comes out of his mouth. Not a tough battle for the Lord. All of the forces on the earth at the time, not a match as the Lord speaks and overcomes it. The earth and the old heavens dissolve, melt away in fervent heat. And then the Lord creates a new heaven and a new earth. So in your preaching, in your teaching, in your sharing with others, what we're marching to is this. We know we at least always have 1,007 years left on the earth. Always. You just don't want to be here past the 7 years. See, the Lord could rapture us tonight, and then the time clock begins. 1,007 years left. And we want to go at the first part of that before the tribulation takes place. So let's take the Lord's words here in Luke 17. He prophesied that the end times for us would play out in the same ways that the flood of Noah's day played out. The only difference being the type of destruction. But we are going to see the same patterns as we go through this. We're going to see warning signs in Noah's day that should be warning signs, that should be indicators for us in our day. It should let us know how close we are to that 7 years of tribulation. So, let's look at these similarities as we go. Verse 1. Well, at least we're going to get verse 1 done. Verse 1. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and stop right there, because we have already come to our first connecting point between Noah's day and our day, that first connecting point, that first similarity, that first warning indicator is this: population explosion. How many people were on the earth back then? Well, of course, we don't have the number in Genesis, so we can only speculate, but we can do some really good speculation on this. We're going to take a look at the numbers here shortly, but first keep something in mind as we do this, as we try to figure out how many people were on the earth at this time. Keep this in mind. If everyone dies young, population takes quite a long while before it gets out of control. Because there's that give and that take. You get new people on the planet, but you lose some to death. There's a smaller net of souls. There's a smaller net of population when people die at young ages. And I'll call 70 and 80 and 90 and 100 years old young compared to what we're dealing with in Genesis 6. All right, now, as people live older, as they have a longer life expectancy, as there's more longevity to life, that makes population explosion a major problem. I don't know if you realize this or not, but Adam was a contemporary, meaning he lived at the same time as Methuselah. And Methuselah was a contemporary of Noah. So just 3 people have spanned the entire early millennia of the world's history. 3 people: Adam, Methuselah, and Noah. So basically, when you get to Genesis 6, nearly everyone is still alive because they're living into their 900s. You've had some people pass, but here's what you mostly get. More kids, more kids, more kids. Hardly anyone's dying. And so the population just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. There's no equalizer. There's no balancing out. Now here's a quick example to help you understand a little bit just about how population can grow so quickly. Let's lay down a quick pattern, and then we'll just extrapolate. We'll follow this pattern out. Here's the pattern. If a husband and wife have 4 kids, and then that pattern is followed out, every one of their kids goes on to have 4 kids, and they live to see their grandkids. That's the pattern. The husband and the wife, they have 4 kids. Their 4 kids have 4 kids. And the original parents live to see the grandkids. Same with the second generation. They live to see their grandkids. So you got 4 and 4 from each 4, right? And if you try to do this on paper, you start with 2 at the top. And then you do the four, and then you do four from each of those ones, and you run out of paper really quick because you get to a point where you're not adding, you're multiplying, and you're multiplying over multiplication. It happens really quick. If you follow that pattern out, in just 5 generations, 2 people, a husband and wife, from that one family, in 5 generations, they will have had 96 people in their family during that time period. Now, if you double that number from 5 generations to 10 generations, you go from 96, you don't double the 96, You're doubling the generations, but multiplication is happening. So now you go from 96 people to 3,070 people from the 5th generation to the 10th generation. If you double the 10th generation, you go to 20 generations now. You go from 3,070 souls to now 3,120 souls in just 20 generations. Now, take that one more step, not even doubling the generations, but going from 20 generations to 30 generations, and the multiplication is so out of control that you go from 3,120,000 to now 3,220,000,000 souls. 30 generations from one family, one couple. Now, considering the fact that those folks were dying off, right? And now you just erase that when we take a look at the population that would exist in the time of the flood, Genesis chapter 6, and you realize these people are living for a long time, and you take and you just make a conservative estimate. You take all of the names that we know that we have, or all of the mention of a kid that we know that we have in the Scriptures. You take just the ones we know about, and you average out extremely conservatively that each one of those people had 4 kids. By the time you get to Genesis chapter 6, you have potentially 4 billion people alive on the planet. Now, if you take a more reasonable number, knowing what we know about how many kids you can produce in 900 and some years, if you take a more reasonable explanation, you're pushing over potentially the total population in our world today, which is currently at 7.7 billion, almost 8 billion. It is absolutely possible that the population was that high in the day of Noah. And from the time that Noah went into the ark with his wife, I almost said his 3 wives, with his wife and his 3 kids, and their 3 wives, 8 souls, right? That's who was saved in the flood, 8 souls. From the time of the end of the flood until 1867 AD, it took that long to reach 1 billion people on the planet. So that would be right around the Civil War, right after the end of the Civil War. From the flood of Noah to right after the end of the Civil War, 1867, to reach 1 billion people on our planet. Why? Why did it take so long? Well, we had a lot of problems. We had plagues and diseases that we couldn't control. We had wars. The life expectancy for people was very short, 30s. People were lucky to make it to 40s in some of those eras as we climb up to 1867. So it took that long to reach 1 billion people. But then listen to this. To go from 1 billion to 2 billion people, it only took from 1867 to 1935. That's 68 years. That's it. That's all it took to get another billion, to double it. And from 1935 to 1965, that's all it took to reach 3 billion people. 30 years. And from 1965 to 1995, it doubled in those 30 years to 6 billion people. As of 2019, here we are at 7.7 billion. And it seems like most of them live in New York City. It's just what it seems like to me. Have you ever drove through there? Believe me, that's what it feels like. But the population today is growing exponentially. out of control. We're not living as long as we used to, but we've just reached the point where there are so many people that multiplication is tough to get under control. There are 360,000 new births every 24 hours. 360,000 new births. But there are 151,600 deaths each day. So what is our net? Our net is that every day we add 208,400 new people to our planet every day. Every day this earth gets a new shipment of 208,400 new people. It is no wonder that the elites are so interested in population control. That's all right, you don't know about that stuff. That's conspiracy theory. Just forget I said it. I got to admit, I would be okay with less people on the planet. I would be okay with smaller numbers. Not population control. I'm not talking about knocking people off. We're not going to run that kind of ministry here. But I'd be okay with a smaller population of people, less traffic, shorter lines at Walmart. We'd have less people to reach for the gospel, but instead, we have a major issue with just reaching our planet because every day, if 208,000 people move up the ranks, that means every day there are 208,000 plus people that move into the age of accountability. Every day, we've got 208,000 new souls that we are responsible to reach with the message of the gospel. We're going to need more workers. We're going to have to start hanging some sheets back there for volunteers. We have got our work cut out for us. Now, in the areas where population gets too dense, we notice some pretty different behavior patterns from the people there, don't we? You notice a different vibe when you go into a big, crowded city as opposed to when you're in a more rural city? You notice the difference in the vibe, right? Well, sociologists noticed that as well. So decades ago, I believe several decades ago, about 20 or 30 years ago, they did a study and they decided to use rats in their study. It makes sense because they were studying the rat race. They wanted to take these rats and they wanted to study them and observe them in the same population density as the population in New York City. And they wanted to observe how the rats would behave in that kind of population density and see if they could make any connections with human behavior and what takes place in cities. I find it interesting that they use rats to do this with NYC because I just read an article today that said there are as many rats in New York City as there are people. There's one rat per person in New York City. So very fitting. But they took these rats and they're studying the rat race and they put them in this dense population to simulate New York City. And what they found was that the first major change they noticed in the behavior of the rats was that the mothers began neglecting the babies that they gave birth to. I don't know, maybe they were off working on their careers or something. But they did. They neglected to take care of the baby rats. They began to abandon the baby rats. The second thing that they noticed was an increased aggression and agitation. The next thing they noticed was that the rats started to turn on one another and fight with one another. And then finally, the whole experiment ended with the rats turning to cannibalism. Is that what it's called when an animal eats the same kind of animal? I know that's what it's called for humans, but so the rats began to eat each other, and here's the kicker. They had been provided with plenty of food and water the whole time. They had it. It was there. But the behavior changed so much from the population density that it just drove them insane. Now, does that sound like our big cities or what? Have you ever drove through Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York City? I'm telling you, it sounds exactly like what happened with people. So I guess what they discovered was that it's not good for populations to explode within a city, within a confined location, we become irritable, we become unhappy, we become aggressive. And so when we get down to verse 11, probably next week in Genesis chapter 6, we are not surprised then, knowing what we know about the population of Genesis 6, we're not surprised to hear the Lord say that the earth is filled with violence. It is one of the natural products of overpopulation. I think so much of the reason behind the aggression, the hostility, the animosity, the fighting, the murdering, the killing, the violence in our day is simply related to this population explosion. I'm going to point out to you as we go through the scriptures how I believe it has always been God's design to spread us out. You'll see this in scripture. It starts with the Tower of Babel. It has always been God's design for us to multiply and cover the face of the earth, spread out. I don't believe it is ever God's design for us to bunch together in one city. And so as I study through the scriptures, it sure seems to me that the big city model is not something that the Lord would put His stamp of approval on. You'll see it with me as we go through the scriptures. It's always God's intention to give us space. Now, I don't know if you've had the privilege of living in a rural place where you can't see your neighbors unless you go for a drive. If you've never been able to live in a situation like that, maybe you don't know the difference it makes. But I'm telling you, as a pastor that has lived in many different places, sometimes I forget to even name them all when I go through them. As a pastor that's lived in many different places and many different home settings, I can tell you I was able to come to a place of being content no matter where I lived. It wasn't always easy, but I will tell you I was never quite so joyful and happy as when I couldn't see my neighbors and I had some space to breathe. I believe the Lord knows we need that. He just did not intend for us to live all squished together. But anyway, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be before the coming of the Lord. Population explosion. If you have the privilege and opportunity to sell your city home, where you're stacked neighbor on top of neighbor, sell that home, move out into the country, I promise your life happiness will immediately go up. You're better off in a cabin in the woods than you are in a mansion squished between other houses in a city block. I'm just telling you. And I want you to know we provide that service here at Anchored. We have a realtor here on staff that can help you sell that old home in the city and find a nice place out in a rural setting. So right here in Anchored, we provide that ministry for you. Right, Judy?
Yeah, those are hard to find now. Everybody wants it.
And we'll talk about Anchored's percentage for the referrals too. But as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be before the coming of the Lord. Population explosion. Okay, number one, check mark. We're there. Population is out of control today. Reading on in verse 1. And daughters were born to them. Verse 2. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Verse 3. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Now, in case you haven't noticed it, there is a great mystery developing here in verses 2 and 3. And we're going to define it, but let's begin with this. There was some sort of mysterious marital and sexual union that grieved the Lord to the point where He would finally come to the climax and say, okay, that's it. I have got to bring this to an end. Their days are numbered. That's what we see in verse 2 and 3. So what was the mysterious union producing? We're going to talk about what that union was, but first off, what was this union in verses 2 and 3 producing? It was producing giants. Verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, if you have never studied through this and heard some of the explanations of what is taking place, I am about to challenge your thinking. You may never come back. But read this carefully, verses 4. Yeah, not 5 yet. Read this carefully, verse 4. It says that there were giants during those days, meaning the days of Noah, Genesis chapter 6. And the scripture says there were giants also afterward. After what? After the flood. We have a lot of things happening here in just a few words. The first thing we see is that in Noah's day, living with normal human beings, there were giants on the earth. Were they all destroyed in the flood? Absolutely they were. They were so big you couldn't get them on the ark. They all died in the flood. All of the giants died in the flood. They make a comeback after the flood. We'll see them quite a bit through the journey of the Old Testament. You'll see the nation of Israel as they come out of the desert wandering and get ready to go into the promised land. You'll see Israel facing these same things, these giants. You have King Saul and King David battling with these giants all throughout their respective reigns. These things have made a comeback after the flood. To my knowledge, they're all gone now. We only have the New York Giants, and they're not even a very good football team. But they were there before the flood. They make a comeback after the flood, and we were told right here in verse 4 how these giants were produced. First of all, the word giant. The word giant is the Hebrew word Nephilim. And we're going to have to look to the Hebrew on this because our English translations don't help us very much. But if we understand the Hebrew language, the original language, we can understand what's happening here. I don't have to stand up here today and tell you I'm guessing about what I believe. I know what the scriptures are saying, and that's what I'm going to share with you. And then the question is going to be, is your faith big enough to believe it? But we are told about these giants. It is the Hebrew word Nephilim, which means two different things. First meaning is giants. That's why it's translated that way. It's a little harsher in the Hebrew. It's tyrannical giants. And the second meaning there of the word is fallen ones. So if you've ever heard of the Nephilim before, you may have heard of them being referred to as giants or as fallen ones. Well, both of those are accurate with the Hebrew. So what we get from that is that there were these giant creatures that were not holy, that were not following the Lord. They were wicked. And we're told how they're produced. These giants are born when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. The sons of God cohabitating, having sexual relations with the daughters of men. What does that mean? Well, you'll have some good people, some good scholars come along and try to make the Bible a little bit easier to swallow and a little bit easier to believe. So they'll say the sons of God is a reference to the godly line of Seth. And they'll say that the daughters of men is a reference to the ungodly line of Cain. So they'll say what's taking place here is the godly line is commingling with the ungodly line. And this grieved God to the point where he had to shut the whole thing down and bring a global purging, a global cleansing, and start over. But here's the problem with that belief. Here's the problem with that interpretation. It creates many holes in the count that we just read, and it does not coincide with the original Hebrew words. Because listen, the Lord told us the same thing. As believers, we are not to marry unbelievers. We are only to marry in the Lord. But believers still marry unbelievers, don't they? It's tough to stop them. I just love him. I just love her. I'm going to change them. They end up changing you. Pastors know that. They try to tell you that. You get married anyway to an unbeliever. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to only marry in the Lord. But here's the good news. If a believer marries an unbeliever, if a godly person marries an ungodly person, their children are normal. They're not giants. So why would the union of Seth's line, the godly line, with Cain's line, the ungodly line, why would that produce giants? And the answer is that it wouldn't. There's something much different going on here. We've talked about this a little bit. That word, sons of God, in the Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, sons of God, every single time that you read it in the Old Testament, it refers to angels. That is such a well-known fact that the Septuagint, when it translated the Old Testament, if you don't know what the Septuagint is, that's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That is the version that the apostles in the New Testament many times quoted from. They would quote from an Old Testament Greek translation of the Hebrew, the Septuagint. Well, when they came along to translate the Septuagint, they did not use a word equivalent to sons of God. They took that word and they translated it as angels. It always means angels. I've heard people say, well, there's one time that it didn't mean angel. And that's when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fire. And King Nebuchadnezzar said to his fellows, hey, didn't we throw only 3 guys in there? And they said, why, yes, your Nebbiness, we did only throw 3 guys in there. And then Nebi said, well, I see a 4th guy. And he said, the 4th guy is like the Son of God. And they say, see, that's different. That was referring to Jesus. But that's not what King Nebuchadnezzar was saying. He wasn't saying, look, the 4th guy looks like the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, the Messiah. King Nebuchadnezzar didn't know about that. What King Nebuchadnezzar was saying, he was making the same point that I'm trying to make here. King Nebuchadnezzar was saying, the 4th person that I see doesn't look like something from this world. The 4th person that I see is angelic, godlike, otherworldly. That's what he was saying. It always in the scriptures means angels. B'nai Elohim, sons of God. It always means angels. By the way, it was a singular there when he referred to Jesus. That was true. That was the Son of God. But he was saying it looks like an angel. But that word, sons of God, B'nai Elohim, always means angels, and there is never any kind of interpretation on, or let me put it this way, there's never any distinguishing between holy angels and fallen angels. So the Bible throws that word out there, sons of God, angels, in the Old Testament, and then it is up to us to read the context of where that word sits to find out if it's referring to holy angels or fallen angels. So now are you understanding what's taking place in Genesis chapter 6? These Nephilim, these giants, these fallen ones, these wicked ones that are not quite human and being produced from this relationship of the sons of God, angels, with the daughters of men, mankind, women. Do you understand who we're dealing with here? Does this sound like, let's just take a look at the context. Does this sound like the holy angels took a liking to the women of the earth? Of course not. If so, they became fallen angels real quick. Obviously, what we're dealing with here is a sexual union between fallen angels and women, and through that union, these giants, these children, these hybrid humans / angels, fallen angels, are born. I know that sounds really far-fetched. But this is point number 2 in our connection with Noah's day and our day. Point number 2 is this. There will be rampant sexual perversity that is tough to really stomach for the godly person. So, Arlyn, are you saying that they actually, angels, fallen angels, came together with human women and they had offspring? And are you actually saying that we today could possibly be seeing and experiencing the same things in our day? Well, I will say this. By the grace of God, these kind of interactions with demons no longer produce giants. I don't know at what point God shut that down, but something happened. But I will tell you this. There are reports every day of people having sexual encounters with demons. I don't know how naive you are to your world. I don't know if you know everything that's going on out there. I would tell you to go home and study these two words, incubus and succubus. And yet I don't think I really can, because I'm not sure I want you guys reading that stuff. But it is a phenomenon that happens on a regular basis where both men and women report having sexual encounters with either quote-unquote ghosts or demons. I'm telling you, it happens. Now, there are plenty of stories. They come out all the time. There are plenty of stories, but some of those stories are really tough to disprove. Handful of years ago, there was a young lady down in the Philippines who was all mixed up in the occult. She opened all those doors. I don't know what it was, but I hope you know what those doors are today to the occult. Things like Ouija boards that 8-year-olds can buy. You know, you have to be 21 to buy alcohol. You have to be 16 to drive, but you can summon demons at 8 years old by buying a Ouija board from Hasbro or whatever. Ouija boards, cutting, all of these different other things that open up these doorways for demonic oppression and possession. Well, she got mixed up in that occultic stuff. And she was also mixed up in crime, and she got caught for a crime, and she got thrown in prison. And what took place was very bizarre and puzzling. She would at nighttime be screaming for help from the guards. And in the morning, she would wake up with fresh bite marks and scratch marks on her body in places where she couldn't have produced those marks. Well, the guards, disturbed by the behavior and yet not believing, of course, the woman's story, because her story was that in the nighttime she was being sexually assaulted by demons. They didn't believe her. And they let it go on for a handful of days, and finally they reached the point where they realized, we got to do something about this. This woman is harming herself, or one of the other prison mates is harming her. And so they put her in solitary confinement. You know what solitary confinement is? Hopefully you've never been there before. Solitary confinement is just you. And sometimes they put you in the padded cell and they lock your arms in that looks like a life vest. They put her in solitary confinement, and the same thing kept happening. She would wake up and there would be fresh bite marks and scratch marks on her body in places that she couldn't reach. They finally began to believe her that she was being sexually assaulted by demons, by unclean spirits, and they finally reached out to 2 missionaries that live in the U.S. but happened to be there in Manila in the Philippines at that time, Bob Larson and Lester Summerall. And they were down there. They reached out to them. They questioned them about it. They brought them into the prison. Those 2 men, those 2 missionaries came in. They laid hands on that young lady. They prayed for her. They asked the Lord to cast away the unclean spirits and to set this girl free, and it never happened again. And I'm telling you, that's just one small part of it. But these things go on. They happen. We are as twisted and perverted sexually in this country today, I think, as they were back then. I don't even want to get on the stats. I mean, this is my soapbox, you know. And when I get up on this, well, you know, this is my soapbox. But there are only a handful of sites that are more viewed on the internet than pornography. And those are sites like Fox News, Yahoo, Google, the search engine. I hope at least the search engine has more. There's a few more mainstream sites, only a few of them that have more traffic daily than the next three on the list, which are pornography sites. And then when you go in to start digging into some of the things that the keywords that people are searching for as they go onto these pornographic sites, you begin to realize how perversely sick we are as a society. Without a doubt, that's what we're seeing in this chapter. Fallen angels with women producing these giants. So, connection point number 2 between us and Noah, intensely perverted sexual immorality. You look at the support for this story about the giants, you'll find it everywhere. The Bible is not the only culture that says this. You will find the story of giants in other cultures. Archaeology has discovered these things in their digs. Regular science doesn't like to accept that, but they find these drawings, they find these writings. You have mainstream writings like the Book of Enoch. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but the Book of Enoch is supposed to have been the writing of Enoch himself, the one that the Lord raptured before the flood. And in that book, he goes into great detail about these Nephilim, and he explains them exactly as I explained them to you. That book is part of some Bibles out there. The Ethiopia church. Several different other churches and areas, they have that included in their Bibles as Scripture. We don't have it in ours because we feel like it doesn't measure up doctrinally, or we don't feel like there's plenary inspiration for that book, so we leave it out. But I will tell you, it is a good historical source to read, just like any other history that you read, because there's another guy that somehow came up with this story a long time ago and explained it as exactly as I explained it to you. Lots of other things confirm. There are photos on the internet of giants that have been uncovered, bones that have been unearthed from archaeology. I don't put too much stock in that because all of those photos are contested. They say they're not real. It's tough to know what's going on out there, but we have plenty of proof. My proof is what the Hebrew Scriptures plainly say.